I'd like to dedicate my part of this evening to my uncle, Orrin Hackman. He was a wonderful guy, too. Thank you very much.
Why would a two-time Oscar winner admit that he made a mistake? The 95-year-old tough guy who won an Oscar finally talks about the mistake that haunts him the most. Superman wasn't being walked away from. There was no altercation with Wes Anderson. It was something much more straightforward. And it permanently altered Hollywood. Before he died, he acknowledged that acting became more difficult rather than easier. Hackman's startling admission demonstrates why he was always unique, even as other celebrities strive for stardom. California. His mother, Annalita Elizabeth Gray, was Canadian, and his father, Eugene Ezra Hackman, operated a printing press. His family moved frequently in search of stability during the Great Depression. They had moved to Danville, Illinois, where they lived with Hackman's maternal grandmother by the time he was a small boy. Hackman made the decision to pursue acting when he was 10 years old. He was enthralled with the intensity and presence of James Cagney's performances after seeing them on the big screen. But it's not possible. His family didn't have much money, and life was unstable because they were constantly moving. His resilience in his career was shaped by the difficulties he encountered as a child. Hackman's parents separated when he was 13. His father waved briefly before driving off without saying anything. Hackman remembered that moment for years. It seemed like a farewell, a quiet reminder that he was alone. His mother made every effort to assist, that he carried with him the emptiness his father had left behind, which subsequently enabled him to give his acting more nuance. Hackman's adolescence was a time of uncertainty. His family moved around a lot, staying in places like Iowa, Illinois, and California. Fitting in became more difficult with each step. He struggled in school and frequently felt alienated. He took a risk when he was 16. In 1947, he joined the U.S. Marine Corps while lying about his age. He desired order, self-control, and above all, an escape from his turbulent home life. Hackman was a field radio operator in the Marines for 5 years. During Operation Beleaguer, a tense time after World War II, he was stationed in China. Dismantling Japanese military hardware to prevent it from ending up in communist hands was his responsibility. Tensions between local factions and American forces were high, and the work was hazardous. He was sent to Japan and Hawaii after China. He learned discipline from life, but he also learned how to endure hardships. After being hurt in a motorcycle accident in 1951, Hackman was released. He had no clear direction at age 21. Using the GI Bill, he briefly attended the University of Illinois to study television production and journalism but left. He took odd jobs as a doorman over the ensuing years. Truck driver and furniture mover. It didn't seem to fit. He took a chance at age 27. He started studying acting at the Pasadena Playhouse in California. He met Dustin Hoffman at Pasadena, another budding actor who, like him, didn't conform to Hollywood's conventional norms. Their shared outsider status and drive for success brought them together to form a close friendship. However, their experience at the Playhouse was far from positive. The school rejected them outright rather than merely doubting them. Both Hackman and Hoffman were voted the least likely to succeed by their teachers and fellow students. Hackman even got the lowest grade the school has ever awarded. He could have been crushed by that kind of rejection, but he resisted. Hackman relocated to New York City after leaving Pasadena. He had no backup plan, no steady income, and no connections. He took any jobs he could find to make ends meet. He spent the night polishing leather chairs at the Chrysler Building, moving furniture, and even working as a doorman at Howard Johnson's in Times Square. When a former Pasadena instructor saw him one evening at Howard Johnson's, he recognized him and made fun of him, claiming he would never amount to anything. Although the word hurt, it only made him more determined. He subsequently characterized his attitude at the time as "me against them." Every insult and rejection served as motivation to keep going. He got his first off-Broadway part in Chaparral in 1958. Although it wasn't a major production, he had an opportunity to establish himself. He had a talent for giving characters a sense of realism, even in supporting parts. He lived in an apartment with Dustin Hoffman and Robert Duvall during this period. All of them were struggling actors in New York City who were looking for a break and chasing auditions. Hackman landed his first movie role in Mad Dog Call, 1961, 3 years later. It was a biographical crime movie about infamous gangster Vincent, also known as Mad Dog Call. Hackman had a small part as a police officer. Even though there were only a few scenes, it was his formal Hollywood debut. Another soon-to-be famous actor, Telly Savalas, made his cinematic debut in Mad Dog Call. By Hollywood standards, Hackman started late. He was almost 30, but he was determined to succeed. In 1963, he made his Broadway debut in Children from Their Games. But everything changed on Any Wednesday in 1964. One of the greatest comedies of its era, the play was performed 983 times. Sandy Dennis, who received a Tony Award for her performance, co-starred with Hackman in the role of Cass Henderson. Many initially questioned whether the play would succeed, but it ended up being a critical and commercial success. Hollywood began taking notice of Hackman after realizing how well he could combine humor and sincerity. After taking notice, director Robert Rossen cast Hackman in the drama Lilith, 1964, which starred Warren Beatty. Although it was a minor role, it prepared the ground for the subsequent events. Bonnie and Clyde, 1967, 3 years later, Everything. In Arthur Penn's groundbreaking crime drama, Hackman portrayed Clyde's older brother, Buck Barrow. By fusing historical narrative with contemporary storytelling, the movie reinvented the gangster genre. Hackman stood out in a cast that included Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty because he gave Buck Barrow warmth and depth and made him seem like a real person. He received his first Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor for his performance. Hackman's casting was largely due to Warren Beatty, who also produced Bonnie and Clyde. He was impressed when he saw him in Lilith. Beatty defended Hackman during the casting process, describing him as a gifted, honest, and natural actor. It turned out to be the right choice. One of the most important movies of its era, Bonnie and Clyde received 10 Academy Award nominations. In 1971, Gene Hackman rose to fame in Hollywood with The French Connection. He gave one of the most powerful performances in a crime movie ever in his role as Detective Jimmy Popeye Doyle. Eddie Egan, a real-life NYPD detective, served as Doyle's model. He wasn't your typical hero. He was reckless, angry, and short-tempered. He made poor choices and drank excessively. However, he was also committed to eliminating criminals at all costs. He felt authentic thanks to Hackman. Viewers were unable to turn away. He became one of Hollywood's greatest actors thanks to his performance, which won him the 1972 Academy Award for Best Actor. The movie itself altered the narrative of crime stories. It was directed by William Friedkin in an unvarnished and unpolished manner. It didn't have the feel or appearance of a standard Hollywood thriller. New York's streets seemed vibrant, perilous, and tense. One scene was made famous. As the streets were congested with cars and pedestrians, Doyle pursued a suspect in a car beneath an elevated train. Because of how intense the scene was, it ended up becoming one of the most well-known car chases in movie history. The intensity was maintained throughout Hackman's performance. Doyle was named one of the greatest movie characters of all time by the American Film Institute years later. Hackman nearly missed out on the part. At first, Friedkin thought about bigger stars like Steve McQueen and Paul Newman, but both rejected it. Friedkin had reservations even after selecting Hackman. Even Hackman found the role difficult. Doyle's violence and aggression bothered him. He was pushed too far by one scene. He was forced to repeatedly beat a suspect, which made him so uneasy that he almost stopped working on the movie. But he continued. He trained with Eddie Egan for weeks, learning about the experiences of actual drug officers. Hackman was able to fully comprehend the role thanks to that experience, and his portrayal of a police officer in a film became one of the most realistic ever. The French Connection's popularity prompted a follow-up in 1975. John Frankenheimer's French Connection 2 transported Doyle from New York to Marseille, France. The story was darker this time. Doyle was apprehended by drug dealers and coerced into becoming addicted to heroin rather than pursuing criminals on the streets. Hackman gave a vicious and memorable performance during the withdrawal scenes. He conveyed Doyle's suffering and despair in a way that seemed utterly authentic. The tone of the sequel was different. The first movie moved quickly and had a lot of action. Doyle's personal struggle was the main focus of the second. The change was praised by some critics. Others thought it lacked the original's vigor. Although it wasn't as well liked as the original film, Hackman's performance was still a standout. By revealing a man who was not only tough but also broken in many ways, he gave Doyle more depth. No role was ever the same for Gene Hackman. He made a career out of being unpredictable in the 1970s and 1980s, effortlessly switching between comedy, drama, and action. Each character had depth, and each performance felt new. It would be good, but audiences never knew what to expect. He starred in the disaster movie The Poseidon Adventure in 1972, which was a huge box office success. He portrayed Reverend Frank Scott, an unusual priest. Scott was not a quiet or submissive person. As a fighter, he risked everything to keep a group of survivors alive while they navigated a capsized ship. The intense action in the movie felt authentic because of Hackman's enthusiasm and conviction in the part. 2 years later, his path was entirely different. Hackman portrayed surveillance specialist Harry Cole in Francis Ford Coppola's 1974 film The Conversation, who was consumed by paranoia and guilt. His action-packed role in The Poseidon Adventure was the exact opposite of this. Cole was alone rather than leading others, plagued by the fear that his work could result in homicide. Hackman's performance was understated, based on apprehensive looks and subdued tension. The movie revealed a new side of his talent and garnered 3 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture. He did something unexpected that same year. In Mel Brooks's comedy Young Frankenstein, 1974, Hackman portrayed a blind recluse who unwittingly frightens the monster. Despite being brief, the role was hilarious. The scene was one of the funniest in the movie because of his flawless timing and delivery. Hackman demonstrated that he was equally adept at comedy and drama. He rose to prominence as the decade's most well-known villain in 1978. When he portrayed Lex Luthor in Superman, he crafted a terrifying yet wildly entertaining portrayal of the character. His Luthor was more than just a villain. He was full of conceit, funny, and charming. He made himself memorable with lines like, "Doesn't it give you a shudder of electricity? To be in the same room with me," and with a mix of humor and menace. At the time, his goals were wealth and power rather than dominating the world. He made Luthor feel authentic despite not shaving his head for the part and instead using wigs. Hackman returned for the sequels in 1980 and 1987 after the movie became one of the decade's biggest hits. He had switched to more emotionally charged roles by the middle of the 1980s. In the 1986 movie Hoosiers, he portrayed Norman Dale, a disgraced coach who was trying to salvage his career by winning a championship game for a small-town Indiana basketball team. The movie went on to become a sports classic. Dale was portrayed by Hackman as tough but profoundly flawed, a man who had made mistakes but was committed to making amends. His performance elevated the movie beyond a basketball narrative. It was about the strength of belief and second chances. It was named the best sports film of all time by the Associated Press in 2020. One of his most impactful performances followed. He portrayed Rupert Anderson, an FBI agent looking into the 1960s murders of civil rights activists, in Mississippi Burning, 1988. The film, which received 7 Academy Award nominations, addressed racism and injustice. Anderson was complicatedly portrayed by Hackman. As he battled against ingrained hatred, he was stern and unyielding but also kind, displaying both rage and empathy. His portrayal solidified his status as one of Hollywood's most daring actors and earned him an Oscar nomination. In 1992, Gene Hackman won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for one of his best performances ever in Unforgiven. He didn't initially want the role, though. Little Bill Daggett, Clint Eastwood had him in mind from the beginning, certain that Hackman's dominant presence would make him the ideal sheriff. Although Hackman enjoyed the script, the violence made him hesitant. He wasn't sure if he wanted to be in a story about violence. Eastwood had no intention of letting him go. Unforgiven wasn't a typical Western, he explained. Making heroes out of murderers or exalting shootouts were not the goals. It was a story about the repercussions of violence and how it only made things worse. Hackman was persuaded by that. He accepted the role, and his performance was remarkable. His little Bill was more than a bad guy. He was a police officer who thought he was acting morally, while his own brutality spiraled out of control. Despite only having a $14.4 million budget, the movie made $159 million, making it a huge success. Along with Best Picture and Best Director for Eastwood, it took home 4 Academy Awards. However, Hackman's performance had the most impact. He thanked Eastwood for the chance when he accepted his Oscar at the 65th Academy Awards in 1993. Although Hackman described the experience of working on the movie as wonderful, not all of his productions were as successful. Younger actors found it difficult to keep up with him, and some directors found him intimidating. This was never more evident than on the set of the 2001 film The Royal Tenenbaums. Royal Tenenbaum had been written by Wes Anderson especially for Hackman. He envisioned him as the film's protagonist, a cunning and self-centered father who managed to retain some of his charm. However, it was difficult to convince Hackman to join. Hackman finally agreed after Anderson persuaded him for more than a year, but the two soon fell out. Anderson had a controlled and exacting style. Hackman's was impulsive and erratic. He was impatient with lengthy takes and intricate instructions. Anger. The cast and crew became notorious for Hackman's harsh insults directed at Anderson at one point. It was not the end of the tension. Luke Wilson found it difficult to keep up in scenes with Hackman, and Angelica Houston later acknowledged that she felt intimidated by him. Bill Murray, who didn't appear in many scenes with Hackman, began to show up on set merely to support Anderson because of the extreme pressure. Despite his respect for Hackman, Murray realized that things were becoming out of control. In order to keep the movie on course, he intervened as a mediator. The Royal Tenenbaums succeeded both critically and commercially in spite of all the challenges. The film's high point was Hackman's performance. He made Royal, a man with many regrets who still couldn't stop being himself, both lovable and infuriating. He proved that he could produce amazing work even in the midst of chaos by winning a Golden Globe for Best Actor in 2002 for the role. Hackman was the same as ever. Tough, exacting, and totally dedicated to his work. He never considered himself a star, only an actor going about his business. Eastwood observed that Hackman's intensity gave Little Bill a sense of realism on the set of Unforgiven. Despite all of the tension behind the scenes, his performance on The Royal Tenenbaums was unforgettable. Gene Hackman made the decision to retire from acting in 2004. That decision was heavily influenced by his health. His heart wasn't strong enough for the demands of filmmaking, according to a stress test conducted in New York. The doctors told him to relax. Having had an angioplasty in 1990, Hackman heeded their cautions. Later on, he referred to this incident as the stripping point. The comedy Welcome to Mooseport, starring Ray Romano, was his final motion picture. He loved to act, but he was no longer interested in the business side of Hollywood. He likened it to something he no longer wanted to go through, a frying pan. It wasn't a slowdown when I left Hollywood. Hackman began writing, which he had begun prior to his retirement. Wake of the Perdido Star, his debut novel, was published in 1999. Daniel Lenihan, an archaeologist, co-wrote it. The book was a 19th-century historical adventure. Together, the two continued to write Escape from Andersonville, a novel about a daring prison escape during the Civil War, and Justice for None, a story about a World War I veteran. Hackman wrote independently as well. He released Payback at Morning Peak, a western about a teenager who wants to exact revenge for the death of his family, in 2011. He published Pursuit, a crime thriller about a police officer pursuing a murderer, 2 years later. Elmore Leonard and Ernest Hemingway were among the writers who inspired him. He felt more creatively free when he was writing than when he was in Hollywood. He enjoyed being in charge of his stories and working alone. It felt personal, too. His dad had operated a newspaper press. Other family members had been journalists. It was in his blood to tell stories. In Santa Fe, New Mexico, Hackman established a peaceful life with Betsy Arakawa, his second wife. While Hackman was filming a movie in the late 1980s, they had developed a deep affection for the region. They purchased a 12-acre plot of land north of town and transformed a basic block house from the 1950s into a house that combined Spanish Baroque and Pueblo design elements. Hackman was able to concentrate on his writing and painting, two other lifelong passions, there. When he began attending classes at the Art Students League of New York in the 1950s, he fell in love with painting. In order to capture the beauty of the surroundings, he frequently drove into the mountains in Santa Fe with his oil paints and canvas. A few of his pieces were on exhibit at nearby eateries where he also made investments. Hackman was famous, but he never cared to make a statement. He was observed by the locals driving his pickup truck, doing yard work, and living a simple life. The demands of Hollywood were completely absent from Santa Fe. Hackman had spent decades juggling his family and career before relocating there. On January 1, 1956, he wed Faye Maltese, whom he had met at a New York YMCA dance. He was a 25-year-old ex-Marine attempting to pursue a career in acting. She was employed at Rockefeller Center as a bank secretary. They brought up 3 kids. Leslie N., Elizabeth Jean, and Christopher were born in 1960. The 1970s and 1980s were a boom period for Hackman's career. He became famous thanks to movies like Superman and The French Connection, but they also kept him away from home for extended periods of time. He acknowledged that work frequently took precedence over family. In an interview in 1989, he stated, "I took jobs that would separate us for 3 or 4 months at a time, even though I had a family. Eventually, the strain became too much." He and Maltese divorced in 1986 after splitting up in 1982. After that, she led a quiet life before dying on April 26, 2017, at the age of 88. Later, when Hackman looked back on those years, he admitted that personal relationships were frequently eclipsed by Hollywood. Nevertheless, he was thankful that he could support his family. By the middle of the 1980s, Hackman had fallen in love once more, where she pursued a career as a classical pianist while working part-time. Their ages were 32 years apart. His age was in his mid-50s. She was in her middle 20s. However, they had a close bond. They had relocated to Santa Fe by the late 1980s. After getting married in 1991, they created a life full of small joys. Hackman discussed their quiet routine, their love of low-budget movies, their road trips through New Mexico, and their Friday stand-up comedy viewings. They spent years remodeling their house together and co-owned Pandora's, a Santa Fe home decor business. They adopted multiple dogs because they both had a passion for animals. Despite having one of Hollywood's most illustrious careers, Gene Hackman frequently reflected on his past with a twinge of regret. He wished he had gone back to the theater, even though he was successful on the big screen. He acknowledged that returning to New York in the late 1970s or early 1980s may have helped him gain a deeper understanding of acting in a 1999 interview with Charlie Rose. He made his stage debut in the 1960s, appearing in Broadway shows such as Death and the Maiden and Any Wednesday. However, he stopped performing live as his film career took off. He was unable to return because of the demands of theater and his increasing inclination toward the coziness of movie sets. That regret was about development rather than lost chances or notoriety. Acting, according to Hackman, got more difficult with time. Not any simpler. His sense of obligation to produce something significant increased as he gained more knowledge. His pride in his accomplishments was never overshadowed by his desire for the stage, which exposed an unrealized aspect of his career. He had always been passionate about acting, and that desire persisted even after he retired. Hackman acknowledged that he missed acting, even though he left the business on his own terms. He even showed off his skills years after he had retired. Once, in Santa Fe, while dining with a friend, there was only instinct, no camera, no script. People were reminded of his unique talent in moments like that, but he never faltered in his resolve to leave. Retirement was essential for his mental and physical well-being. Hackman's influence on acting extended well beyond his own roles. He changed the definition of a leading man. He preferred realism to glitz and disapproved of Hollywood's polished image. His characters felt authentic, even if they weren't always likable. Flawed, resilient, and incredibly human. Personal experience was the source of that authenticity. When Hackman was 13, his father left the family, a traumatic experience that influenced his capacity for intense emotion. He gained resilience from his time in the U.S. Marine Corps prior to becoming an actor. His performances were driven by these struggles, giving each part a sense of realism. Few people thought he would succeed in the beginning. He was deemed least likely to succeed by his classmates at the Pasadena Playhouse. Hollywood was also unkind. Alongside fellow underdog Dustin Hoffman, he worked odd jobs for years while dealing with rejection. But there was never a chance of giving up. He demonstrated that success wasn't reserved for the young when, at the age of 37, Bonnie and Clyde finally made him famous. He received his first Oscar for The French Connection at the age of 41. He had won 2 Academy Awards, starred in innumerable iconic roles, and earned the industry's respect by the time he retired. His films never shied away from challenging material, such as racism in Mississippi Burning and corruption in Unforgiven. Clint Eastwood and Francis Ford Coppola were among the directors who commended his ability to give each character, whether a hero or a villain, nuance. Hackman beat to his own drum, as actor Josh Brolin famously remarked. A unique combination of vulnerability and toughness that served as an inspiration to generations of performers. Gene Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa, died on February 26, 2025, at the age of 95, at their Santa Fe, New Mexico, home. They were found during a routine visit by a maintenance worker. Investigations were ongoing, but authorities did not find any evidence of foul play. Hollywood was rocked by the news, and tributes began to pour in. According to Francis Ford Coppola, he was a great artist. Viola Davis referred to him as one of the greats, highlighting his capacity to strike a balance between sensitivity and strength. An era came to an end with his death. Hackman left behind one of the most cherished legacies in movie history, despite never pursuing fame or following Hollywood's rules. Generations will be impacted by his contributions to cinema, his influence endures, and his work endures.